Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is William Murdoch with the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, or MORPC. I want to welcome you to our speakers series for our regional housing study. We appreciate the time you're taking today to join us for this next installment of our speaker series for the regional housing strategy. We know this has been a crazy time for you, your communities, and your families. Things are constantly evolving and we're all adjusting to this new virtual world. So at moments like this, I want you to know that your work as employers, as public servants, service providers, nonprofits, and so much more is as essential as it's ever been. Please know that MORPC and our team are here for you. We're a resource for you. We are all in this together. So despite these uncertain times, our work at MORPC continues, and you all know that we launched the regional housing strategy last year because there was a clear need for more affordable housing, more housing for more people all across Central Ohio. And today that need remains just as great, and the regional housing strategy is still a critical piece of us moving forward in addressing this. Housing is both an essential need and a human need, and a need for the fabric of our communities, and we don't take our responsibility for this work lightly. We've developed this speakers series on housing as a way of further connecting our members and our team and our experts to the region. Experts who can provide information and resources and help inform our regional housing strategy. So our work with the regional housing strategy continues to move forward, even though our daily routines have changed. And today you'll see with our speaker series, it's going to move forward as well. And today's topic of evictions has emerged as a really critical one among all of our partners before and during the health crisis, and with good reason. As you'll hear from our speakers, the number of evictions in our region may surprise you. And as we're navigating this unprecedented health and economic crisis, the impact to household stability is severe. I'm looking forward to it, and we thank you for joining us today to be a part of it. But before I turn things over to Kirsten Carr to introduce our speakers, we know you may have questions and concerns, and we will have plenty of time to address them during this call and afterwards. So on that note, logistics. We ask that everybody mute their microphones and cameras unless you're presenting or speaking. If you're participating on a computer, and we hope you are, please use the chat feature to comment and ask questions. We're monitoring it the whole time. You can also email your questions and concerns to Jennifer Knoll at jnoll@morpc.org. If you're participating by phone, make sure you're muting yourself, and if you need to unmute, you'll also have to dial *6. Thank you so much to my team for pulling this together and keeping the housing strategy moving forward, and thanks to our speakers today. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce MORPC's Director of Planning and Environment, Dr. Kirsten Carr. So Kirsten, please go ahead.
Thank you, William, for that overview, and good afternoon, everybody. We're so glad you were able to join us today. As William mentioned, we're in the middle of our work on the regional housing strategy right now, and the goal of this work is to deliver a clear direction and framework for investment, policy, and programs to really guide not only our elected officials and their communities, but also the private sector and the real estate development community toward a goal of meeting our region's need for safe, decent, attainable housing for every resident. And so there's been a lot of important work that's already been done on this issue locally. Probably many of you have been involved in those projects, but there are very few research studies that really tackle the housing needs of our entire region. And so the regional housing strategy is creating a new baseline of information that we can share across our region that didn't exist before, while also pushing the boundaries of the information we already have. And you all know we are a very diverse region. And we know that the needs and opportunities look quite different in Marysville than they do in Columbus or London or Newark or Grove City. And so we aren't just looking at conditions at a regional scale, but also taking a closer look at counties and municipalities and even submarkets within communities to really identify which actions would work best where. And so our timeline right now is to hope to have this regional housing strategy wrapped up by the summer. We had to push it back a little bit because of COVID-19. We wanted to make sure that we had enough opportunities to really do our outreach and public engagement and hear from all the different audiences that can inform the study and the strategies moving forward. But the research we've done so far has uncovered several critical challenges facing our region. They might not be surprising to you, but as you can see them on the slide, we have kind of bucketed them into 5 categories. First, we know we have an increased competition for homes shaped by our population growth, a low rate of housing production, and then also the ripple effects from the Great Recession. We also know about the barriers to home access that include disparities in lending practices, creditworthiness, housing instability, and housing discrimination. Unfortunately, we know there's a limited supply of housing that's affordable to our low-income households and fewer affordable single-family rentals as well. We're also seeing a growing demand for more housing options that's really fueled by the demographic trends of our baby boomers retiring, becoming empty nesters, our growing population of millennials and younger adults, and then also a growing number of individuals with specific needs. And last, but certainly not least, probably one of the most important pieces is housing instability, with housing cost burdens, evictions, and homelessness creating outsized effects among our residents. We entered the year 2020 with a serious shortfall of housing supply and issues when it comes to affordability. And the health crisis right now not only sheds more light on these issues, but also brings new concerns forward. And I don't know if any of you were able to listen in to the CMC luncheon yesterday with Stephanie Hightower and Dr. Roberts. It was an incredible, strong and good conversation. But one of the things that stood out to me was Stephanie Hightower with the Urban Lead shared that there will be likely 3,000 people by the end of June waiting on eviction proceedings. Today, we already have more than 1,000 residents in need of shelters. In fact, when we did our housing study and some of the research uncovered that our eviction rate per 100 residents is almost double that of the national average. And I'm sure our speakers today are going into that some more. But that's a good moment right now to really thank all the service shelter agencies and all the work that our nonprofits are doing to help make sure that our most vulnerable residents are taken care for and have housing in this time of crisis. And it's really with this context that I want to move us into today's panel discussion on evictions in Central Ohio. And guiding us through this important conversation is our moderator, Columbus City Council member Shayla Faber. Councilwoman Faber has a long career dedicated to housing-related issues and is a great person to help moderate this discussion today. Prior to joining council, Faber served as an assistant city attorney in the Columbus City Attorney's Office. There, she implemented initiatives to address vacant and abandoned properties, along with a receivership program. These initiatives effectively helped to decrease our vacant and abandoned property count and to put once blighted properties back into the housing market. Today, she's the chair of Columbus City Council's Housing Committee and continues to be a strong advocate for affordable housing and has been a wonderful partner for the regional housing strategy as well. So it's my honor and pleasure to turn it over to you, Councilwoman Faber.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you to the entire team at MORPC for inviting me to be a part of this important conversation today. I want to start off by recognizing the work of MORPC and our partners across Central Ohio for their work in launching the Regional Housing Study. Prior to the current crisis, we are all experiencing with the spread of COVID-19, we were facing an affordable housing crisis in our region. I think we are all familiar with the data and the major concerns, including that we are around 54,000 units short and growing of the affordable housing that we actually need, and that there are just not enough projects in the pipeline to support those needs, and that we need to take a serious look at our policies and practices that are holding us back from really being able to tackle this problem. Our rapid growth as a region brings many opportunities, but it also creates the potential for social and economic divides, particularly in areas like housing. And now that we are collectively figuring out how to deal with the new challenges presented by COVID-19 and an ever-changing economic outlook, it is critical that we work together to ensure families in the region have stable, affordable housing. Today, we're here to talk about evictions, a topic that I have spent a considerable amount of time on throughout my tenure at Columbus City Council. We recognize that as rents go up in our community, wages are staying stagnant. And with the onset of COVID-19, families are relying on unemployment and other limited wages to make rent. This means that more households are unstable and having difficulty remaining in their homes. Every year, Franklin County files nearly 18,000 evictions. This is one of the highest number of evictions filed throughout the state of Ohio. And when we look closer at those numbers, we see that women, particularly women of color, are more likely to be impacted by evictions in our community. And that's why last fall I was proud to launch the Eviction Prevention Program in partnership with Impact Community Action and the Legal Aid Society of Columbus to provide emergency rental assistance and legal representation in eviction court. I understand fully that this program isn't enough to fully stop the problem of evictions, but is a model that provides a good start. I'm excited to talk to our panelists today, who will provide some more insight on evictions and the impact on our community. So now with that, I'd like to introduce our first panelist. Ms. Stephanie Pierce is a doctoral candidate at the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University. Previously, she was the director of the Home Ownership Preservation at the Ohio Housing Financing Agency, Her research interests center on how social and economic outcomes are impacted by policy design and implementation. Her current program of research explores housing insecurity, including evictions and homelessness for renters and mortgage default and foreclosures for homeowners. Her mixed methods dissertation investigates the dynamics of eviction, incarceration, and recidivism, and tenants' perception of the short and long-term causes of eviction. Her work on foreclosures include 2 papers investigating the loan performance and employment outcomes of the Hardest Hit Fund program, of which she was the director during her time at OVA. Stephanie is currently on the academic job market. She holds an MPP from Georgetown University. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Councilmember Favor, and thank you to everyone at MORPC for inviting me to present today. So I am going to be giving an overview of data I have collected in Franklin County from the Franklin County Municipal Court that details evictions that have taken place between 1999 and 2017. So I'm going to be discussing what that data revealed, and then I'm going to go into some of the preliminary findings from my own research. So if we can go on to that first slide. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so as of the 2016 data that is available through the Princeton University Eviction Lab, about 1 in 19 renter households in the United States experiences an eviction each year. Next slide. So if we zoom into Ohio, that number goes to about 1 in 16 renter households. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that that number is even higher in Franklin County. So in 2016, there were 16,796 eviction filings in Franklin County. So here you can see how they are distributed, and people familiar with Franklin County will recognize that sort of upside down T pattern where we see a lot of similar negative social outcomes occurring in the same neighborhood. So we can see that evictions are occurring in those same places. Next slide. Okay, and then between that same time period, there were at least 40,000 set-outs in Franklin County, and I derived this number from data that I collected myself, as well as some of the annual reports that are published by Franklin County Municipal Court. Next slide. Okay, so Congresswoman Favor mentioned that I was formerly the director of the Hardest Hit Fund program at the Ohio Housing Finance Agency. When I decided to go back to school and start studying evictions, one thing I wanted to do was throw the numbers up on a chart and look at how evictions compared to foreclosures. Because when I was the director of the Hardest Hit Fund, I was overseeing a multi-million-dollar foreclosure prevention fund. And so I was surprised when I put these two numbers together and realized that during the same time period in which the federal government invested $762 million in foreclosure prevention in the state of Ohio, our eviction filings numbers were significantly higher before, during, and after the Great Recession. Yet during that same time period, there was no coordinated federal investment for individuals who were experiencing eviction. So I just think that it's really stunning to put these two things together and realize for how long this issue has been overlooked and understudied as a possible trigger and contributor to a number of negative social outcomes in our communities. Next slide. So since 2016, when Matt Desmond achieved every PhD student's dream and turned his dissertation into a national bestseller, there has been an explosion of new research in the area of eviction. So I just want to highlight some of the new findings that we are seeing. Some of these papers I've cited here have been published, some have been presented at conferences, but I've just noticed over the past couple of years as I've begun working on this project, how many new people are getting involved, how many new researchers are getting involved in looking at eviction from a number of different angles. So we know that eviction has been linked to a risk of employment and lower earnings, and that is because of the time spent searching for a new apartment and that very short period of time in which you have to take off of work to try to do that. So that can actually contribute to negative employment outcomes, as well as financial strain. There's some emerging research that finds that people who are evicted and evicted more than once that are in this category have lower voting rates because of the difficulties updating voter registration. There is a new study out of Notre Dame that has linked eviction to decreased reporting of intimate partner violence out of fear of having the police called to one's house too many times and then being evicted as a result. And evictions have also been linked to poor health outcomes and even increased mortality. Next slide. So when I started looking at this topic, there was a quote in Matt Desmond's book that really stuck out to me, and it is this: in poor Black neighborhoods, what incarceration is to men, eviction is to women. A typical but severely consequential occurrence contributing to the reproduction of urban poverty. Both the mark of a criminal record and the stain of eviction can attenuate one's chances of securing decent, affordable housing. So in other words, poor Black men were locked up and poor Black women were locked out. And I wondered whether this connection between eviction and incarceration might be more than metaphorical. So if we go to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about what I have done. So the first thing I did is collected some data on evictions and data on incarcerations, and I like to show these two maps back to back so you can see this pattern of eviction filings 1999 to 2017 next to the pattern of incarcerations during that same time period. So if you could flip to the next slide there, and you can see that it is almost exactly the same map. So those are the same neighborhoods that are being affected by both phenomenon. So that led me to think that there may be a connection between these two issues. So we'll go to the next slide. What I did was I scraped eviction case filing data from 1999 through 2017 from the Franklin County Municipal Court website. That led to 336,299 cases that pertain to over 400,000 tenants. and with just a few limitations. So I was able to retain most cases. Now, those of you familiar with this data will know that Franklin County Municipal Court does not collect any information on demographics. So we don't really know a whole lot about who these people are, but I was able to conduct a surname analysis. So I used individuals' surnames and their geocoded locations to predict their likely sex and likely race. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so this tells you a little bit about what was going on with these folks. So again, this is 1999 through 2017. So during this time frame, nearly 70% of the individuals who had an eviction filing ended up with a judgment on the first cause. So the first cause is that part of the filing that that returns the property to the landlord. So in other words, if you get a judgment on the first cause, the court is saying you have to leave the property, and we're going to give you about 5 to 6 days to do so. So it's a very short time frame. There are also second cause judgments, which is when the landlord is also asking for repayment of funds. But for this project, I was primarily focused on the impact of that first cause. So what happens when somebody is forced to leave their property? And then I found that for those judgments on the first cause, about another 80% actually, the landlord went out and got a writ of restitution. So that's that order that gives individuals 5 days to leave the property. And then of those, about 17% ended up with a physical set out, where a bailiff from the court goes out to the property and oversees the landlord removing individuals' physical belongings and putting them out in the street. So about 30% of cases resulted in a dismissal. And interestingly, about 80% of those dismissals were from the plaintiff. So that means that the dismissal occurred because the plaintiff, so the landlord, either worked out some sort of agreement with the tenant, or before the actual hearing, the tenant was able to come up with the money, or they left on their own. And so the plaintiff themselves requested a dismissal because there is no need to force the tenant out of the property. About 3% of those cases, there was some sort of agreement, formal agreement that was entered into the court record between the tenant and the landlord. And then again, going back to the predictive analytics I used to predict gender and race, we find that in Franklin County, a little over half of the tenants who are going through eviction court were female, and about 40% were Black, so that's an overrepresentation in both categories. And then if we go and take a look at some of the neighborhood characteristics here, I found statistically significant differences in who actually got evicted. So again, that if you do not have a judgment on the first cause, that means that your case is dismissed, or you don't have that outcome where you're being forced to leave. So the neighborhoods, so there was a higher average eviction, so a higher number of percent Black in neighborhoods for people who received judgments versus neighborhoods where, versus no judgment. Okay, and then again, there were neighborhoods with higher percentages of female-headed households. Individuals from those neighborhoods were more likely to receive a judgment. Individuals from neighborhoods where there was a higher percentage of people who had less than a high school diploma were more likely to be evicted. And then again, people from neighborhoods with higher poverty levels were more likely to be evicted. And then also I looked at individuals' predicted race and found that tenants with a judgment were more likely to be Black, so 44%, than were tenants whose cases were dismissed, 40%. White people were more likely to have their cases dismissed, so about 39% of all white people versus receive a judgment. And then there was no substantial difference in gender for people who were evicted. Okay, next slide. Okay, so In this slide, I'm getting into a little bit of my analysis, examining the link between eviction and incarceration. So for this, I narrowed my sample down to individuals who experienced both an eviction and an incarceration. And so on the next slide, I'll present some preliminary findings. So compared to the full sample, the folks that were included in this analysis were more likely to be female and more likely to be Black, older, and less likely to be charged with an acquisitive crime, meaning a crime where they were acquiring something like theft versus a crime of harm or self-harm. And then individuals who received an eviction judgment. So these are people with a past history of incarceration. Individuals who receive an eviction judgment are 30 percentage points more likely to commit a new crime than individuals who receive an eviction notice, but whose cases do not result in a judgment. And this is using a causal method, and this finding is also robust and across a number of specifications. So meaning when I add certain control variables in, when I expand or subtract the amount of time in which I allow people to commit that new crime, this finding holds. So for this primary finding, we're talking about individuals who had committed a crime or who were incarcerated any time in the past 3 years, then received an eviction judgment. They were 30 percentage points more likely to commit a new crime within the next 12 months. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I have another study that I just want to present very quickly. This is a qualitative exploration of individuals who attended an eviction hearing at Franklin County Municipal Court last summer. I conducted questionnaires and semi-structured interviews with about 70 people. And so I'm going to just tell you just a little bit about these folks, and I think this is very interesting to see who was going through eviction court. Next slide. Okay, so in this sample, I saw a very big gender split. So about 3 of every 4 folks that were in my sample were women. About 60% were Black. And the average age was 40, and most had children in the household. And then another pretty stunning statistic here, about 70% of the people that I spoke with reported either having prior literal homelessness, meaning they stayed in the shelter or on the streets, or prior couch hopping, where they reported having to stay with somebody, a friend, an acquaintance, a relative, because they had nowhere else to go. Just about 20% reported having a prior eviction or forced move. And they also reported having housing burdens. The average housing burden reported was just over 50%, which is a pretty stunning number. And then another question I asked was, did you seek assistance? And while over 3/4 reported that they did attempt to seek assistance, either from legal aid or mediation or from PRC, I listed about 30 local nonprofits, and the majority of people had not sought assistance for more than 1 or 2, or were unaware that they existed. Or for those who said, yes, I tried, I contacted 20 of these, found that they were not eligible because of a lack of local resources. Next slide. Okay, and then just finally, very, very quickly, this is my last couple of slides. The survey participants that I spoke with, and also my interview participants, cited financial shocks, medical issues, property conditions, and difficult landlord-tenant relationships. So Kiara here, and of course this is not her real name, discussed how she had a delay in receiving her annual refund from the IRS, and that got her in trouble because she was counting on that to pay her mortgage, something that she does every year. Next slide. James reported something that I heard several times, which was that the landlord sold the property, and then the new landlord either raised the rent or said, I don't want to rent to you anymore. And I did hear that story time and time again. Finally, last slide. And then Alicia reported a medical issue. So she had emergency surgery, which caused her to be out of work, which caused her to get behind on her bills. Again, a number of people that I spoke to reported medical issues. So as I get further in this research and probe a little bit more deeply into the stories that people told me, I look forward to learning what else and what other learnings we might gain from this. So again, thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to answer questions later in the program.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that amazing presentation. The data is it's just absolutely breathtaking, but it's key for us to level set the conversation that we're engaging in right now, and really hits home why this topic is so important for us to continue to discuss and advocate for. So thank you for that. Just a quick public service announcement. For those that can, please feel free to send in your questions for our panelists using the chat feature in the team meetings. Now, we understand that some of you may not be able to use that chat feature. So if you do have questions, do not be shy. You can submit them via email to jnoll@morpc.org. Once again, that's jnoll@morpc.org, and we will address your question with the group. So next we have, I'd like to introduce Ben Horne. Ben became the managing attorney of the housing team at the Legal Aid Society of Columbus in 2014. He attended Notre Dame Law School, where he was the co-recipient of the Dean Konup Legal Aid Award in 1999 to 2000. Ben began his legal career as a staff attorney at the Chillicothe office of Southeastern Ohio Legal Services in 2000. He transferred to the Newark office in 2002 and then served as the managing attorney of the Lancaster office for 8 years before joining our Legal Aid Society in Columbus. Prior to attending law school, Ben worked in Hiroshima, Japan. Didn't know that, Ben, as an English instructor, and then as a translator and assistant project manager for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Since joining Legal Aid, Ben has put a focus on working with code enforcement and the city attorneys on improving housing conditions for Columbus's 200,000 tenants. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Councilwoman Favor, and thank you for this opportunity to talk about evictions. As Sheila mentioned, we at Legal Aid, we have a housing team, and evictions are really the bread and butter of what we do. Our goal with every case that we encounter is there a solution that will keep the family housed? And we also, we've also developed a focus on housing conditions, trying to make sure the tenants are in a place that's safe and up to code. So I'm going to focus on on evictions in Franklin County, and talk about sort of a typical eviction procedure hearing, and then just touch on some of the COVID-19 challenges and adjustments. So next slide, please. So this is courtroom 11B, where evictions are held every morning. The docket can range from, on a slow day, maybe there's 20 or 30 cases. On a super busy day, there may be 250 cases. The average is somewhere in between there. It's probably about at least 100 cases a day on average. Next slide, please. You might need to keep clicking. Sorry. Yep. Okay. Thanks. Great. The Franklin County Municipal Court's at 375 South High, courtroom 11B, Monday to Friday, starts at 9 a.m., goes to about noon most days. Very busy docket, very quick hearings. Magistrates are trying to get through about 100 or more cases most mornings. Next slide. So talking about the eviction process, if a tenant falls behind in rent, the first step is they get this notice to leave the premises, posted, usually just taped to their door. Tells them the grounds for the eviction, puts in some statutory language That's the first step. Next slide, please. And keep clicking through those. Sorry about that. Thanks. Okay, so after the tenant gets the notice to vacate or notice to leave premises, if the tenant's still there, then the landlord can file an eviction complaint at Franklin County Municipal Court. The court then usually sets it for 2 weeks out from the date of filing. There's a summons sent out. And in case I forget to mention this later, currently, when the summons goes out, it goes out with a resource sheet that the court recently put together that includes places like the mediation services, legal aid, impact community action, and Job and Family Services PRC program. So that's been a great help that the clerk's been putting that enclosure in there. At eviction court, if the eviction judgment is granted, the tenant can be set out as quickly as within 5 days. So if the process from notice to leave to when the tenant is actually set out with the supervision of a bailiff, the quickest is about a 30-day process. Next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, keep clicking through. Sorry about this. Yeah, so this is a typical, this is a quick hearing. The magistrates sort of run the hearing themselves. The bailiff calls the case, the parties go up front, they're sworn in. The magistrate locates the notice to vacate in the file, shows it to the tenant, asks, did you get this notice? Were you behind in rent at the time? Are you still behind in rent? Are you still living there? And if the tenant answers yes to all those questions, the tenant's generally going to be evicted no matter what they say after that. Oftentimes then they say, I have some questions. You know, I've been living in a place without heat for 3 months. Why should I have to pay my rent? And then the magistrate will say, well, did you escrow your rent, which is the procedure tenants are supposed to follow, but it's not very intuitive. So a lot of tenants just withhold their rent. And so that will not prevent them from being evicted generally. Next slide, please. This is funny because Stephanie had the same photo, I think, but I wanted to just point out that's sort of what happens. The hearings they're informal, they're quick, and that's a magistrate asking the tenant, did you get this notice? Next slide, please. And there's another one. That's what it actually physically looks like, with the magistrates basically asking those 4 questions to the tenants. Next slide, please. Okay, some reasons why 90% of these cases are for non-payment of rent, and some underlying causes that Stephanie's probably touched on too is the costs of rent are going up faster than wages. Just in 4 years, it's gone up by about $150 for average 2-bedroom apartment. Another thing is, yes, there is you know, there are Section 8 vouchers, there are subsidized housing complexes where if you're lucky to get into those, you're only going to have to pay 30% of your income towards rent. But for the other 3 out of 4 families, these are the ones that are really in the roughest position. They don't have any federal housing assistance. They're trying to pay market rent, and they're often paying 50, 60, 70% of their income towards rent. So if they encounter one financial hiccup, as Stephanie mentioned, somebody, you know, an illness or just losing hours at work or somebody moving out, things like that. They're on a very slim budget trying to just make it work each month. And so when they cannot make it work, then they have to decide who they're not going to pay. And if they decide not to pay the landlord or they decide not to pay their utilities, then this can lead to eviction. Next slide, please. And they're costly to everyone. It's cheaper for the whole community if we can keep the family housed. According to Michelle Heritage, the average cost to process a family through the shelter system in Columbus is about $7,200. There's a lot of costs to the landlord, filing fees, lost rental income, turnover costs, and to the tenant. They have to move. They have to put their stuff in storage. they lose belongings. If there are children in the family, their schooling is disrupted. There's an emotional toll. So that's the reason we're trying just to keep people housed. If we can come up with a solution where the family's not displaced, if we can come up with some finances, then that's the ideal resolution. Next slide, please. When tenants come to eviction court, oftentimes, even though legal aid's number is on the summons, even though there's this resource sheet that goes out, quite honestly, it's often very hard to get a hold of tenants before they actually come to court. When they come to court, they can be helped by attorneys, mediators. I'm going to talk a little bit about some organizations that are helping out on-site at eviction courts since 2016. But they need help. They need to understand how to navigate the system. Oftentimes they come, they owe $800, they've got $500 in their hands, they just want to work out a payment agreement. So mediators can help with that. Sometimes there's emergency financial assistance that they can access. There also a need for social workers. A lot of tenants are not going to be able to stay, and so then they leave the courtroom not knowing what to do. What are my next steps? Is there a shelter I can go to? Are there any available rentals I can look at? How am I going to pay for storage? How am I going to pay for deposit first month's rent at a new place? So there's a need for social workers too, especially for the tenants that are not going to be able to remain in their homes. Next slide, please. As Stephanie mentioned, this 2016 book, Evicted, really brought evictions into the spotlight. Around the same time, there was a focus on family homelessness in Columbus because it was hitting record highs. And the Columbus community really pulled together. There were a lot of focus groups on evictions. What can we do to help this situation? And as a result of that focus, there became a new setup outside eviction court. Next slide, please. This community mediation services, they've actually started doing this in 2011. They actually set up outside eviction court in the hallway every morning. They set up a table with some pamphlets on resources, and they offer their mediation services. They have increased their number of mediators, so there's now 4 or 5 there every morning. In 2017, we at Legal Aid started a tenant advocacy project, which is an on-site. Again, it's just a folding table in the hallway. We started with 1 full-time attorney, and just 1 full-time attorney being there basically doubled the number of tenants that we were able to represent. It's been a popular program. We're up to 3 full-time attorneys. City Council has helped us pay for one of those. We also added a paralegal and a social worker in 2019, so it's become pretty robust. 2018, Franklin County Job and Family Services set up a PRC worker in the hallway. PRC is basically emergency financial assistance up to $1,500. It can go towards rent. It can go towards a security deposit. You have to have minor children in the household, and you have to have you have to be able to show that after you get past this hiccup, after you get this chunk of money, you're going to be able to continue to pay your rent. So it's not for everybody, but it is a good source for a lot of families. And so they're in the hallway as well. And also in 2019, the Veterans Services Commission set up a table as well. Next slide, please. That's a mediator speaking with the tenant. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the tenant advocacy project in the hallway outside courtroom 11B. Next slide, please. So I think all of this, there've been, because of the increased focus on evictions by the whole community, by the hallway help, we've started to see some numbers that are getting better. It's still pretty bad, but when you look at the number of evictions that were filed in 2015 and 2019, they basically stayed the same. The number of judgments, that means the tenant actually got a judgment from the court saying you need to vacate. Those numbers have gone down. The number of set outs have gone down. And in the meantime, the population's gone up, and the 2-bedroom apartment fair market rent has gone up. So we would expect that the number of evictions filed, the number of judgments, the number of set-outs would all increase, and they have not. So we think that it's making a difference, all the focus the community's had on evictions. But there's a long way to go, but it's I think we're seeing some good trends. Next slide, please. Okay, COVID-19. On April 6th, Judge Barrows issued an administrative order, actually updating an earlier one. Under this order, landlords are allowed to continue to file evictions against tenants who don't pay rent. However, there are no hearings until June 1st. Also, no tenants will be set out until June 1st. So everything's pretty much on hold until June 1st. Under the current order that starting on June 1st, the court will begin hearing 100 cases per day, and bailiffs can start setting people out again. There's a backlog of cases. I'm in frequent contact with the clerk, and currently she's got over 1,000 cases that she's getting ready to, or she's begun scheduling for the first weeks of June. But this is estimated to rise dramatically with non-payment of May rent. And most of these cases are probably going to be filed the second, third week of May, when tenants cannot afford to pay rent any further. A lot of tenants had enough savings for 1 month, and so they were able to pull off April, but not. We estimate that there's going to be a huge increase in people that can't pay their May rent. There is no statewide moratorium on evictions. Each court's making its own rules. So in various counties, there's still eviction court happening. Next slide, please. There's some safety challenges that are going to go along with opening the court with 100 new cases per day. And social distancing is going to be an extreme challenge. People if there's 100 families trying to get to courtroom 11B by 9 a.m., they're going to encounter a lot of areas where they're going to be in close contact with people just getting up to the courtroom. If you've ever tried to enter 375 South High at 9 o'clock in the morning, it can be, there's these revolving doors, and sometimes you spill out into this security area that's just completely packed with people. There can be elevators to the 11th floor that are packed. And then the seating area itself, when you have a docket of 100 new cases a day, that's going to be a very crowded courtroom. Another challenge is tenants with symptoms or who are ordered to self-quarantine. Currently, there's no option of these folks participating remotely by phone or video, and they're going to have to come to court in person. Next slide. Next slide, please. And then there's the financial challenges. It's going to be a lot of tenants who haven't paid their rent because of COVID-19 related job loss. And unfortunately, we've been asking, but I don't believe there's any rental assistance earmarked for rental assistance or any of the federal funds on federal or state funds right now, and nothing is earmarked for rental assistance. And for a lot of tenants that we hear from, they say, yes, I know I'm supposed to get the stimulus check. I've applied for unemployment compensation, but I don't have that money in hand yet. So there is a need for emergency financial assistance. We're hoping that we'll be able to access that, help tenants access that, so we don't have to see another bunch of people getting set out and putting a strain on the shelter system. Next slide. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you again for this opportunity, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ben. We truly appreciate that insight into what's happening right now in our courts. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and we've got some questions to field. So I'm going to kick the first one off to Ben. Ben, you indicated in your presentation that there's no moratorium right now on evictions. Can you speak to the legislation that has come through the CARES Act that provides a moratorium on federally subsidized properties?
Thank you for bringing that up. Yes. So the CARES Act does have an additional moratorium that's nationwide, which prevents the filing of evictions for non-payment of rent from federally subsidized housing, or if the tenant's living in housing with a federally backed mortgage. So those tenants are protected. The landlords also are not allowed to charge late fees or even give those tenants notices to vacate.
Thank you, Ben. The next question, we'll kick it over to Stephanie. Stephanie, the Eviction Lab recently produced a COVID-19 housing policy score, which rated statewide policies regarding emergency eviction and foreclosure moratoria across the country. Ohio does not have a statewide policy addressing the housing instability. What steps might Central Ohio's local governments take to maintain housing stability for their residents during this challenging time? Stephanie, you there?
You're muted, Stephanie.
I was talking about muted. I apologize. So in that particular report, there was a list of recommended actions and some things that other states and localities have put into place. And so I always think that taking a look and seeing how those actions are working can be useful. But I think it would certainly be helpful to take a look at what that local moratorium on evictions might look like. And particularly, I've been concerned about the availability of forbearances to individuals who own properties, and whether or not there might be a mismatch between the forbearances. So in other words, like, are those landlords passing along those savings to individuals who are renting from them, or are they still demanding rent? So I think that is something to take a look at. And also recognizing that, particularly for these people who may have lost their job due to COVID, that once they are able to go back to work, it's going to require a little transition time. So we had that learning back when I was doing foreclosure prevention work, that just because you start getting a paycheck or you have that job and you start on your first day, it doesn't mean that you're instantly financially recovered. It can take some time, and sometimes it even takes 2 weeks to 4 months to get that first paycheck, and you have other debts and priorities. So so I'm going to be interested to see how our localities can innovate and learn from each other.
Stephanie, that's it's a great answer, and you bring up the reality that there is for many property owners the consideration that a forbearance, a 90-day forbearance with your financial institution could provide a little bit of some comfort for landlords. Is that enough? And are there any other consideration for landlords since they could be losing their primary source of income that you would advocate for?
Sure. So, yeah, that's a great question, because when we look at what is the most effective means of preventing foreclosure, I have a paper that just submitted to a journal very recently. It's available on SSRN, so I can always send that out if people are interested. But we found that stabilizing mortgage payments during a period of unemployment can help prevent foreclosure. And actually, if you think about it as a sort of a supplement to unemployment insurance, and you compare our findings with other studies that look at that compare generosity and unemployment benefits, we do find that that increasing either the generosity of an unemployment benefit or stabilizing mortgage payments by directly paying that mortgage during the period of unemployment can really prevent foreclosure, and it's very effective. The problem is that those programs are typically not available for non-owner occupied properties, and that's what we're dealing with landlords. So while I do know that landlords have been able to get these forbearances, the structure of the forbearance really matters. So if the forbearance simply means that it's, once that 90 days is up, you're on a pretty stringent repayment plan. Perhaps having to even double your mortgage payment over the next few months, that's going to be very tough for landlords to achieve. And they may not, just because that forbearance is over, doesn't mean they're going to have a paying tenant. So that's going to be really tough to balance. The other way forbearances are sometimes structured is that the money, that 90 days of payments, is capitalized on the back end of the loan, but then in the end, that makes the entire loan more expensive because you're paying interest on that those capitalized payments for a number of years. So the best structure would possibly be just to bump out that mortgage term for 3 months, just put a pause on it. And what I have heard from some of the other housing experts is that it's really going to be up to individual homeowners to negotiate that with their banks, because what the banks are doing right now isn't federal policy. It's really just voluntary. And hopefully they're taking into consideration the learnings from the Great Recession and the best way to do these things so we can avoid foreclosures. But it's very unclear, and there's no one way that banks are doing things. And so I do have concerns about landlords' ability to access assistance, like unemployment benefits and that sort of thing, if their primary source of income is rental, and if they are at least able to negotiate a forbearance, the structure of that forbearance could end up hindering them after the forbearance is over, depending on the structure. So yeah, that's such a great question, Council Member Favor, and I just don't know. It's gonna remain to be seen how this shakes out.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. Ben, do you know if there's any discussion about extending the hold on eviction hearings when the stay-at-home orders are start to get lifted in the state of Ohio?
That would be great. I don't know. I think it's up to the administrative judge if he's going to extend things further. I can tell you that there's a need to extend it further. Just as what we've been talking about, there's so many unknowns right now. There's so much money that perhaps landlords are going to get, that perhaps tenants are going to get. But for a lot of these folks, they're going to be willing to make the landlord whole once they get their funds, but they just don't have them yet. And whether they'll have them by June 1st or not is, again, one of those unknowns. Unemployment, the comp agent, like the ODJFS is obviously swamped with these applications. They're doing the best they can. So we're encouraging tenants to reach out to the landlords and say, hey, I'm trying. I'm willing to make you whole once I have these funds. And hopefully most of these can get worked out, but additional time would be helpful.
Okay. And looks like we've got time for just one more question. And I'll kick this to either one of you. Do we know if the cost to provide more housing assistance at the government level is less than the financial cost to actually shelter a family? And so I think that's something to truly dive deep into, because most people know that here in the city of Columbus, we worked very quickly to meet the demands of our homeless population that were going to be disproportionately affected by COVID-19, and making sure there were various shelters set up very quickly to house them. But also countering that with the need to interject assistance to tenants right now to ensure that we don't add to the shelter system. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
Well, I would say most tenants, when they come to eviction court, they're about $1,000 behind. Now that may be increased because of COVID-19. It may be more like they owe 2 or 3 months rent. But yes, I think that an injection of money at that level upstream at eviction court, instead of having this family end up in a homeless shelter and cost $7,200, I mean, just the finances of it seem to me to make sense to be focused on trying to keep these families housed.
Yeah. Stephanie?
Yeah, and I just want to add to that the cost wouldn't just be the amount of money to house them in the shelter system. You know, the cost is going to be bigger, because if you're talking about a family, particularly a family with children, that experience of becoming homeless and having to enter the shelter system is a traumatic experience. And so it is going to have longer term cost on that family and society than just that one shelter stay. There hasn't been a ton of good research that itemizes those costs and understands those, but we do know from an intuitive level that, for instance, if a family ends up in the shelter system and then ends up rehoused and has to move, and a child has to switch schools, there are costs to that that trickle down. So it's a bigger issue than just looking at the shelter cost. And so for me, I agree with Ben. I think that injecting that money early and providing that early intervention and stabilizing the family is well worth it.
Thank you. Thank you both. I truly appreciate this riveting conversation this afternoon. I think it's important that we don't stop the conversation here, but we consider what actionable steps we can take right now to tackle this problem. First, I think it's important that we all continue to lobby our state and congressional leaders for continued support in the form of dollars to support housing and rental assistance in our communities. As City Council, we are fully committed to supporting these efforts, but the buck doesn't stop with us at the local level. There will be additional stimulus packages and bills at both the state and federal level, and we must make sure our voices are heard and that our needs are accounted for. Additionally, we must also capture the attention of our judicial branch. Ultimately, the court is a critical partner in how we handle evictions in our community. How can we work in partnership with the courts to support both tenants and landlords through this eviction process? I believe the courts can be a willing partner, as evidenced through the Franklin County Municipal Court Clerk's new policy to shield online eviction records after 3 years. And finally, I'd like to offer that I'm open to all ideas and innovation in this space. We all have a responsibility to tackle this issue, but no one has all of the answers. Please reach out to us if you have any suggestions to offer. Again, I want to thank MORPC for convening this conversation, and thank you to everyone who has taken the time to engage with us on this topic. And with that, I will turn it back over to MORPC for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Councilmember Favor, for doing such an excellent job with moderating today's discussion and really for leaving us with a very important call to action. Thanks to our outstanding speakers, again, Stephanie Casey Pierce and Ben Horne. We appreciate your time and your expertise on this issue. I think our panelists came today with a very clear message. Evictions are a pressing issue in our communities, and we have to work together to address these as well as their underlying causes. This is even more important in today's climate where we're dealing with crisis and uncertainty at an unprecedented level. The regional housing strategy will aim to address this challenge along with other housing challenges that are facing residents here in Central Ohio by offering implementable actions that can move the needle on supply, affordability, and instability. The final report is due out later this summer, but that does not mean that you as community leaders and decision makers need to wait that long. We certainly invite you to join us, to join Councilmember Favor, our speakers, and all of our partners on this effort to work toward these solutions together. So with that, I thank you again for your time, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.